Do all the young people in your future sound like Adam Sandler? Hello, everyone, and welcome to Irenicast, the weekly podcast dedicated to conversations on faith and culture. We are your hosts. I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
This week, we are going to be talking about total depravity. Are we evil? Are we bad? Are we broken? Are we despicable pieces of flesh walking around the world?
Are we down with this sickness?
Exactly. And then after our conversation in honor of Back to the Future Day coming up on Wednesday, October 21st, 2015, we will be giving our predictions for 30 years into the future. So let's just get right into it. This conversation and this topic is motivated by a listener email that we got a couple months ago, and because of our scheduling and all that kind of stuff through the summer, we haven't really had a chance to get to it, but we figured this is as good a time of any to really get into the subject, because it's a big one. It's a deep one, and we're hoping to try to get some of the main points. So Alan, why don't you go ahead, and I think you have the email up. Why don't you go ahead and read it so we can kind of get an idea of where this conversation is going to go?
Sure. Okay, this is a listener email from Emilie. Could you record an episode about the total depravity slant of evangelicalism? I grew up in the fundamentalist Christian church and am consistently surprised at the many levels and intensity of shame I am still having to unravel from my life, even after many years in a less condemning faith community. There's just something about being told every Sunday morning and Sunday evening, Wednesday night, etc., for decades on end, that you are dirty, sinful, wicked, and completely worthless without a very specific understanding of Christ that can really get its way into one's mind and spirit. What are your thoughts on total depravity and original sin? In an American context, how has it shifted from being the T in Jonathan Edwards' version of Tulip to contemporary evangelical shaming/redemption? Is radical corruption a basic tenet of your faith? I don't have the theological understanding to grapple with these questions in a formal way and would appreciate your help. I love the show. Thanks, Emilie.
Well, thank you, Emilie, for your kind words at the end. And, I think before we tackle this particular issue, because I think there's some terms in there we should probably define before we move forward. But to me, the heart of this is her experience is driving this question about these theologies and stuff like that. So maybe we should start with, does anyone relate with that, feeling those things because of that?
Yeah. Has anybody ever heard someone say they felt that they were dirty, sinful, wicked, or completely worthless after going to a sermon or to church? Have you ever heard that from anybody else? Because I certainly have. I mean,
yeah, absolutely. Wait, what are the terms we're defining? Total depravity, right? The T in Tulip is what she's referring to. 5-point or 7-point Calvinism. That's current with some, it's actually kind of a fringe of evangelicalism that would hold to a really strong, what they call Calvinism is actually not very Calvinist. Anyway, total depravity means, what am I trying to say? Not the dispensation, the proclivity to sin, the propensity. Like, we are prone and almost destined to sin. Every single one of us, whether we did anything or not. Sort of?
Yeah.
I think it's deeper than that. I think it's
the background. This is my background. It's hard for me not to get, I don't know, triggered in some sort of way reading this email, because
right, it's upsetting. Yeah.
My background was being told I was dirty, sinful, wicked, and she said completely worthless. It's funny. I just went back to, it's not actually funny, but it's unfortunate. I went back to my home church when I was visiting for my 10-year reunion for high school, and during the sermon, we were told that we were completely worthless. Literally exactly the words she used. Like, these are the bywords that you hear sometimes in churches. And the idea of total depravity is that not that you are as sinful as you could be. This is what I was told in college. You're not as sinful as you could be. It's just that every element of your life is touched by sin. And I think that comes from the original argument of total depravity, which is like the Catholic theologians would say rationality is still good. You know, you can use your rational mind and you can find out some things about God. But reformers and people after them would say, no, total depravity, even your rationality, your mind itself is darkened by sin. It's touched by sin. And therefore, you are completely unable to connect with God without God coming to you. And so therefore we need Jesus completely, because we have no power to do any good, no power to find God. But that whole like complex argument isn't what shows up in the pulpit on Sunday, right? And I think this is part of the emails. Like, how do we go from some of these theological concepts to just preachers standing up in front of the whole church and saying, you guys are worthless sinners and you should be shamed? And
wait, how is it different?
Yeah. How do we get from there to there? I think is kind of.
Well, no, to me, it's like this. It sounds like you're saying the same thing.
I agree. I think it sounds like, because we have
How's that an evolution?
Yeah, there has to be a distinction. I understand that there's, and we're going to talk about this as we go through. There's been an evolution theologically as far as how that has developed and all the different nuances for some, or huge leaps forward for others, or backward, depending upon which way you're looking at it. When it comes to that idea of the term, but I think for me, what resonates most with the email is, number one, guilt for perpetuating that as a youth pastor myself for many years. And then number two, my experience when I think back, like I accepted Jesus into my heart like a million times in junior high and high school, because it was, first of all, salvation, goodness, the ultimate of what God has done in my context was always framed in the context of, if you don't do this, you're worthless without it. There's nothing in you that can do anything. And anything that you've done that's good wasn't even you. It was God. So it was this complete disconnect, and affected, the way that I viewed myself. And it even spilled into when people would talk about, like, when you suffer, and when it came into like apologetics around suffering. Well, you deserve death, so this suffering isn't that bad, but Jesus saved you anyway. Like, anything good that happens is a bonus, because you should be, not even like you shouldn't get anything good, but that you should be like tortured for the rest of your life or eternity. Like the extreme sense of that, and especially through adolescence in youth ministry, when you're already trying to figure out who you are, you're asking those real deep questions about what the kind of person you're going to become, and the insecurity that goes along with it. So when I read this email, I remember feeling that, and then I feel tremendous guilt for perpetuating it.
I've participated in this too.
Mm-hmm. That point needs to be made really strongly, though, the psychological point, like. Right. In the process of adolescence, and this is all of our backgrounds, like all three of us were youth group kids, and we all participated in youth group leadership. And like a lot of these questions, they're nice thoughts to think for the adults in church and stuff like that. And because they already have a sense of selfhood, they can take the good and leave the bad. But for adolescents who are in the process of individuation, of figuring out who they are and establishing their own agency as a human being, to be told, you have no agency, you are powerless, you are worthless. Kids are struggling with depression and all sorts of stuff, but just on a basic human level, like, I want to know that I am able to do good. I as a human being am growing up. I want to be able to know that, like, I can live well. It's possible.
I would say more importantly, like, that I am good, not just that what I do is good, but that is for sure.
Potential psychological trauma is not enough of an argument to unseat this doctrine. I completely agree with you guys. Yeah. But
it is for a whole generation, though. It is for a whole generation.
Hold on, though. For people who would say this is true, it doesn't matter how it affects you, if you like it or not. It just is. Yeah. Like, it does. They wouldn't care that there's psychological damage. They wouldn't care that it takes away agency. So I think it would be a little bit more helpful for us to go into the history of how this stuff came to be and contrast it maybe with the biblical vision of sin, because it's very different.
And before jumping to that, okay. I did want to say one last thing about like our personal anecdotes. Jeff talked about his experience. Mine went to the most crazy level. I feel like I need a badge for this conversation, because I feel like I've got a doctorate in feeling crappy about myself. In my college experience, it got to the point where God did not come to us in Jesus, did not save us because necessarily, like, primarily for love's sake. God was after glory. God wanted glory for God's own sake. And that's why we are saved in Jesus. It's almost like love for us and affirming us is an afterthought. We are nothing like God. There is nothing in us that's desirable. God didn't save us because God loves us or thinks we are worthy of being saved. God saved us just because it brings God more glory. So it gets to an insane level of, we are literally worth nothing whatsoever, even in God's eyes.
Yeah, and then doctrines, and that would be called like an extreme sovereignty view, right? Like a full sovereignty. But what ends up happening for me is that our doctrines of total depravity or inherent evil, original sin, end up kind of saving God. Because what's a really good way to address the fact that there's evil in the world? Well, God has absolutely no responsibility. And if God does allow it to happen, it's to glorify God. Like, that's actually a pretty clean way to wrap it up, but it's really fraught with problems, as we're talking about, right?
If you take away the theological terminology, you're describing a supervillain. You know what I mean?
Yeah, right? Right? Absolutely.
That's actually super creepy.
It is creepy. It is creepy that God has to be worshipped at all costs to God's own creation. That doesn't make sense to me. That God would have to continually basically throw creation under the bus because God somehow needs God's ego stroked all the time. Like, God doesn't, if God is ultimately good and ultimately sufficient in God's self, God doesn't need us to lick the dirt off his feet. So if we're not going to try to save God,
which is, by the way, a really good theological move. I just want to say, once you give up trying to defend God, like, things get so much easier because God doesn't need your defense, right?
Yeah, God's a supervillain. Why would you defend him?
No.
Is God a supervillain? Well,
God loves us.
But if God, so let's follow this thought through for a second. If God created Adam and Eve knowing that they, let's take a really literal view, knowing that they would mess up and introduce sin into the world, and then all of their descendants would sin forever and all time against each other, if God created the world knowing that kind of suffering and evil would be present in creation, then God foreknew that God was creating that kind of evil and God was causing that kind of evil.
And then a lot of them would go to hell, right?
And then a lot of them would go to hell, and there would be just
the glory of forgiving people who don't need to be forgiven outweighs all of that. That's what some people would say. You know what I mean? The glory of God forgiving people who sinned against God's creation and God, outweighs
it's not convincing to me, but sure, it works for some people.
Yeah. So let's do it. You were talking about original sin and where it comes from the Bible, and we can talk about it historically, but it does originate in some ideas that people have taken out of the New Testament. Paul specifically talks about sin entering through one man, like in Romans 5. He makes the argument, just as sin entered through one man, Adam, grace entered through one man, and that's Jesus. So we have this redemption in Jesus, whereas we had this fall in Adam. And everything kind of goes back to the fall. When Adam sinned, a lot of theologians in the Middle Ages and later said all people fell with Adam. We are sinful because our great-great-great-grandfather sinned, and we were all somehow present in Adam when that happened. And so we're all guilty. And that's the idea of original sin.
Or even a lighter version of that is that if one person in this planet screws up and commits sin and does evil, then we're all capable of it, right? And that's I think probably a more true reading of Scripture. And even Paul's teachings about sin, it's more about not transgressing interpersonal boundaries. And if you read sin in Paul like that, it totally changes the game. So go back and do that.
Yeah, but even in Romans 3, he says, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There are two ways to read this. In one way, you can read, it's all possible that we sin, and we all do sin. We all do actions or whatever. But some people have read the New Testament and said we've literally inherited something tangible, like sin, corruption, shame, or whatever, that is passed from parent to child. And that got developed throughout Christian history. Early Christian history, nobody was really concerned about that. They're like, hey, they looked around. People don't always do good. We all have sin. We need help. That was their understanding of sin.
We missed the mark. That's
absolutely.
That's the biblical word. Hamartia means missing the mark.
And until,
just like an archer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So until Tertullian and Origen, and then eventually Augustine, who's the person who constructed the most influential idea of original sin. Until then, you didn't have this concept of passing sin and guilt on from parent to child. And now we have in contemporary American evangelicalism the idea of when you're born, you are born sinful. You look at I've heard so many times people preaching, they'll say, hey, we're all sinful. Just look at a baby. All they say is me, me, me. Wah, wah, wah. I want milk.
Oh my God. I could smack those people. I seriously I get so upset that babies are sinful inherently, or that if babies aren't confirmed or baptized, they go to hell. How
because
freaking
they're not
awful.
They're not sinful, right? They're not sinful. Them crying for milk is not wrong.
how can they cognitively create wrong? They don't even have the brainwaves to be able to do so. But okay, let's back up for a hot second, because okay, Augustine, this point cannot be overstated. The connection between original sin and sexuality in particular. Augustine himself was so distraught over this that not only is original sin basically a sexually transmitted disease, like you said, passed from like parent to child, specifically like the woman to the child, because Eve sinned first, so her body is inherently more sinful a little bit than Adam's. But Augustine was so distraught over this idea that sexuality then is the transmitter of evil, and sexuality itself becomes inherently wrong. And he was so distraught over this, he castrated himself. Okay, so think about the psychosis of this guy getting to determine centuries of Christian theology. Holy crap. And this makes sense as to why sexual sin today, 2,000 years later, or almost, sexual sin is particularly severe in a lot of people's minds. Okay, so
and it's associated with original sin for a lot of people
directly.
But even as far as malehood goes, though, he was very concerned about sexuality. And Adam, as a man, he wrote a lot about Adam being the natural head of the human race because he was male. You know, he was the head of Eve, and he was the head of the human race. That is what that is what imputed our, sin to us, and our guilt was.
Even though that doesn't make sense,
because
Eve had to talk to a supernatural snake to be convinced, and Adam just had to talk to Eve. So I mean, who's really the more powerful being? I'm kidding. I think the whole thing is, I mean, especially as a woman hearing that story and how women have been demonized and literally burned at the stake by the thousands because of their spiritual foremother being more sinful and more carnal and more evil, like that, it just makes me feel sick. So anyway,
that element doesn't make sense to me, but it does make sense to me, this whole thought process, trying to figure out, like, why do we do the bad things we do? Like just that initial drive to understand that. And theology was a really big element of people's worldview, and it still is for me. So I totally get the impulse to be like, we need to explain this. Why are people bad? Like why do we do bad things? And those are two different ideas, right? People are bad and people do bad things. Those are two different, I would argue that they're two different realities, but anyway.
Yeah, and then you fast forward to Luther, and Luther kind of, and some of the reformers took the take of like, the reason they sinned is because they wanted to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and therefore the quest for knowledge competes with God and wants to be better than God. And so that's a little bit different take on it, right? Mm-hmm. So then we can't trust our thoughts, we can't trust our inclinations because they might be tainted with sin. And so we have to walk in humility, like just accepting the fact that we're evil, because otherwise we will commit blasphemy of trying to be better than God.
And that's the great Reformed argument when it comes to the concept of original sin. Catholic theologians during the Reformation would say the rationality is not necessarily tainted by sin. You can rationally think about God and the world without having it tainted by the whole process. But John Calvin and Luther and other people would say, no, you've inherited this corruption, even a corrupted mind, a corrupted intellect from your parents. And so therefore you can't even think about God properly.
Yeah, and so for Luther, like free will and the ability to make any sort of move toward goodness that didn't require the grace of God, like any and he kind of posed it in the opposite direction. He's more talking about the ability to do good. For him, that was utterly unacceptable. That he said, we absolutely have no free will. In fact, our soul is like a horse that's either ridden by God or the devil. And we don't even know which one it is sometimes. Like we're just at the mercy of these divine beings. And our job is to just try to be as open as we can to God. But we have to be completely reliant on grace. And so you can't have a doctrine of total depravity, or you couldn't in historical theology. You can't have a doctrine of total depravity and saying that humans are fundamentally evil, really without the coupling of we are ultimately dependent on God for goodness. And
yes.
And so it's interesting, though, that, Jeff, you brought up like the insecurity of your salvation, because that's a really, really Protestant thing, that you never quite know where you stand with God. And that is a really powerful tool to get people acting out their salvation in quote unquote fear and trembling in like the Pauline terms, because if we don't know if we're saved, if we don't know if we're in good graces with God, in the Lutheran sense, we don't even know if we're elect. We don't even know if we're going to heaven. We don't know who's riding our soul. Then we're going to be constantly acting toward the good because we're afraid, because we want to be included. And so it creates super believers.
Yeah, well, a lot of this is connected to an idea of the afterlife. Like even the punishment of this sin that is in us is progressed to something worse. Like the New Testament says the wages of sin is death. When Adam and Eve ate from the tree, their punishment was death, not hell or eternity or anything like that. Like I think we forget sometimes that in the entire Old Testament, there's no understanding or belief in an afterlife, so to speak, where you live on forever. It is you die and that's it. And everyone dies. So I think that's part of it too, is that we've attached to this idea of what is the end of your sin, what is the end of your depravity as a person. Well, it is eternal punishment, not just death. And I think that adds something to how people respond to it and what it does than anything else.
Yeah, and if you look at the Genesis story, like you're saying, as an explanation for why people die, an explanation for why people can do things in
God's creation, why do people die? That's the question. I mean, that's why people are asking it. But there's a logical inconsistency to what you were just talking about, Mona. It's like the idea that we have no power on our own, yet we are held accountable. Like we have to make sure our salvation is secure, but in the first place, we're not able to save ourselves or walk away from sin without God. Like there is some disconnect between those two things. And I heard that argument in my undergrad Bible college class. We talked about free will, and strongly, the professor strongly said that we do not have a free will. Like we don't have the will to say no to sin and yes to God until God saves us. This is called prevenient grace. Until we get this grace from God that enables us to respond to God, then we have a free will. Then we have the ability to follow the Holy Spirit or sin or whatever. But until you're saved, you don't have a free will. There's this really interesting.
That's interesting because I heard I heard prevenient grace taught in a Wesleyan sense, which is different from what you just said.
Yes.
So prevenient means just it means just coming before. So you can either believe that prevenient grace comes with a direct relationship and confession with Jesus, or it can be informed by natural theology, which natural theology just kind of holds that you can access God through nature. Like if you go out and observe a sunrise, you think, even if you've never heard of a concept of God, you think, wow, there must be something greater that you're in awe of. And that can lead your heart to lift up toward God kind of on your own. Prevenient grace informed by natural theology would say that when Jesus died, grace kind of what am I trying to say? Like a nuclear meltdown around the whole world. Grace went forth into every crack and crevice of this world, or re-actualize something that had been lost. And so people can access God's grace, and and the Holy Spirit can move on them without them even having any sort of relationship with God. So there's what I mean to say is that there's shades and nuance and a pretty big spectrum of how this stuff is thought of by many different people. There's not just one right or wrong way to view this stuff.
But the way that Emilie and the way that I have approached this topic was really informed, not just by the reformers that we've been talking about, but in later American theology, the New England Puritans and people after them. They had a campaign to tease out the details of sin and how sin impacts us. They took it even further to where we are now. And if you don't mind, I'd like to just quote
sure.
Just quote Jonathan Edwards. Emilie mentioned him in her email, and he's a really big figure in North American literature. And he's a really big figure at the college I went to. He's the theological poster boy for a lot of people because he supposedly was a genius. And so this is, and I gotta say, I read some of Jonathan Edwards, and I really love what he has to say in some areas. Anyway, I love some of what he says, and I don't like some of what he says, but that's just me. So he's talking about Proverbs 22:15. Which says, foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. I read that as the propensity to foolishness is there, so teach them to access the rational part of their mind. But anyway, he says, all manhood constantly in all ages without fail, in any one instance, run into the moral evil, which is in effect their own utter and eternal perdition and a total privation of God's favor and suffering of his vengeance and wrath. That's the understanding of Jonathan Edwards, is that all people sin at all moments, and they have that proclivity toward it. without God.
And well, so, and I think that holds that God is this ultimately holy like force that can't touch evil, because if God is fully good, completely and utterly good, then anything outside of goodness, God rejects, and therefore God is wrathful toward. And so if we have like evil in us or we commit evil, God can't touch us. Like God is like oil and water. So therefore God is mad because it separates us from God. This is how this theology plays out. But I mean, if that were true though, and the world is so evil, then God can't like be on earth and really be present with us in our weakness, right? Like God can't be close to us in our times of sin and evil. God has to reject us and be mad at us. I mean, it kind of has these interesting ripple effects.
Well, and we can't discount the cultural influences on these theologies. For instance, when I was an adolescent, I happened to be extremely insecure. So I got to this little game that I played in my head where when things were going good, I just assumed something bad was going to happen, or started to think like if I was anticipating something, convince myself that it wasn't going to happen, so that if it didn't happen, then I wouldn't be super disappointed. So it's just this little thing that I did in my brain. And I feel like theology is kind of the same way, is where you have this initial history of the church where they were persecuted and they were underground. They didn't have time to think about these things. They just lived life and tried to make goodness wherever they went. And then it becomes the power structure where everything's kind of going good. Almost like they had to create a theology to convince themselves that, like, or keep themselves humble or controlled or whatever. Like, it's this, like, that theology is something that develops as kind of out of prosperity, which is ironic. And then I feel like it's developed into something in our culture today where the people that are the most, like, fervently, we're sinful, we're horrible, are the ones that are most prideful. And what they're really saying between the lines is that you're sinful and you're horrible and I'm not, because of this or whatever.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Jeff. Because
maybe I've seen people that are not like that personally, but you do say something that strikes a chord with something Mona has said before, that this is about control, right? Prosperity. This is about the seat of power of the church in society. And if you can tell everybody that they need the church, then you need to come.
If I'm going to write a manual on growing and controlling a population, right? If I'm going to like take notes from Machiavelli, I want people to be afraid of stepping out of bounds. I'm going to create order. This is like a very sinister sort of look at it. But think about when the Puritans came over and started a new society. They needed to create order out of nothing, out of chaos. And so religion becomes, for a lot of spaces, an incredibly powerful tool. And in the Puritan sense, it was a tool for control. Like is a tool for making sure everybody follows the rules all the time without even being told to follow the rules. When no one's looking, they follow the rules because God sees you and God sees your sin and you have to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So, I mean, that's a really powerful method of politics. Religion is a really effective force in politics. So I think you always have to ask the question, even without us telling you what to think or do, ask the question, what is this doctrine actually doing in a political sense? What is it creating? What is it affecting? And what kind of behaviors is it cultivating? Okay, and so it's hard to disparage this. If you read the work of like Max Weber talking about the rise of Protestantism and capitalism, the fact that people work really hard, have worked really hard, specifically out of a Protestant work ethic, that has created wealth and prosperity in the United States in particular. And yeah, that's spun out of control in modern day capitalism. But what I'm trying to say is that people, when they sense that they're working out their salvation and they're called to work, and that's an aspect of their calling, they're going to work super way harder because that motivation is really, really, really powerful. And the fear is really powerful at the same time. And so I think we can't overstate what this doctrine has really done, like, for us, that we benefit from today, but it doesn't mean that we have to necessarily accept it today.
And I think an important caveat to that is not to perpetuate total depravity, is that, well, and I'm just going to speak for myself, but I don't believe, because I agree 100% with everything that you're saying and how these structures are about control, but that doesn't mean that was its intent. It doesn't mean that was like it's this, depraved people that are trying to come up with these ways to control. I think trying to control behavior in a leadership position is a natural thing and sometimes a needed thing. Like it can start as something genuine, like, man, we have this, for instance, as a youth pastor, behavioral problems is, something So I always struggled with, like, how do you get someone to behave during service? You know, that whole, like, because it was important, but at the same time it wasn't very important. And then now with toddlers, like, oh man, you know, behavior becomes something that's natural, and sometimes it's good. You know, you want to do that, but that there's not this. Well, I don't believe, because maybe I just have to believe this, but people are good, and there's, like, we're starting this to try to do something different, but it can morph quickly when behavior is the concentrated result and not goodness for everyone involved.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I do think that people teaching this stuff really are trying to do right by others. I really do. I think they're convinced of it, and I think they're trying to save people, and I think that they think this is the only path. Like, total dependence on God's grace is the only path toward a good human life.
If I can point toward one more political, like, you were saying that this theology serves different purposes, and I think one of the purposes that this serves is the fundamentalist reaction to science. So you have science is unraveling our understanding, you know, literal understanding of Genesis. It is giving us other avenues of information. And if there's no historical Adam, there's no original sin being passed from Adam to other people down to us. So it starts to change our understanding. And it's really threatening to especially the 20th century Christianity. Christianity in America set itself up against science, at least fundamentalism did. And so to protect itself from science and philosophy, this idea that our mind and our intellect is corrupt, it is depraved and wrong without God, protects fundamentalistic Christianity from everything else in the universe. You know, it doesn't matter what scientists are saying because they have corrupt intellect. It doesn't matter what philosophers are saying because that's the road they're going to go down as depraved people. But us who have the truth, like, we know our minds are corrupt, so we just need God to give us the truth apart from all the other corrupt knowledge in the world. And so I'll hear, like, even my pastor of the church I grew up in, my youth pastor is now the head pastor, and he even said things in the last sermon I heard of, like, you think you're so smart, you have man's knowledge, you know, man's knowledge is puffing you up, your intellect is, you think there's answers out there, but really it's just depraved. It's just motivated by the wrong things, comes to the wrong conclusions because it is tainted by sin. And without God, you can't have that access to truth. So really, this is like a powerful hermetic seal for fundamentalistic Christianity. If you accept this, there's no way that you can bring in other avenues of information. And it's just like a self-propagating prophecy or virus. I don't know. You know, it just protects itself. That's what I think
does. I think you brought up something so good. I mean, for me, it's even harder because modern science, like anthropology, psychology, sociology,
yes,
is revealing these things, showing how beautifully and wonderfully made people are. And for example, that someone who's undergone physical or emotional trauma as a child, their brain chemistry has changed such that this is really recent findings, such that they have lower inhibitions and ability to control their actions and are more prone to abuse others because that's what they've been modeled. Like, when you start unraveling this and really looking into how much people are creatures of their environment, it is a threat to, like you're saying, that hermetic seal. So you have to, like, reject it. You have to push all that out, which is so sad to me because science is showing us how incredible the human brain is, how incredible our created nature is, and how good it is, you know? But I think that
that touches on one of the two main reasons, Emilie, specifically, why I reject original sin and necessarily total corruption and total depravity. One is psychologically. I heard it from a professor. I don't think people are problems. I think people have problems, right? Problems are problems. People are people. People are not the problems. They have problems. And they do horrible, wicked, evil things or whatever. But there are more things going on that we can look at in psychology than just saying, oh, that's evil or sinful or whatever. So that's one element that takes me away from that. But the other really is science. Like, if there was no historical Adam, I have to say this, it unravels that theology. I have not personally seen a convincing theology that says there was no historical Adam, therefore there was no fall from grace into sin, therefore we cannot receive sin from our great-grandfather if he never existed. You know what I'm saying? And so that right there itself has unraveled that whole argument for me. So when Paul says all have, sin entered through one man, he's using it as an example. He's like midrashing, right? He's talking about the Old Testament. He's saying, just like you have heard, just like we have in our scriptures, the idea that sin has entered through one man, grace enters through Christ. You know what I mean? He's using that as a logical argument, and that it still stands for me, even if Adam didn't exist. But like the idea of original sin doesn't stand. That whole theological concept falls apart, and you have to go somewhere else. And there's a lot of good theologians who completely agree. They don't see original sin being a part of a good theological understanding of the Bible.
Well, I was going to say, for me, it's expectations. Like, if you tell someone they're crap their whole lives, they're going to be crap because that's all they expect. Unless they do some real work on their own and decide, no, that's not true, they're going to live into that pretty hard. Like, that's just how humans psychologically develop. And
that's
so if
called
you teach
the Pygmalion effect.
If you teach entire populations that they're crap and that they're worthless, like they're gonna rise to that occasion, or rather sink to that occasion. And I think, for me, the reason we have such a violent society that is mistrustful and selfish is, and selfish in like a really negative sense. I think some selfishness is apt for survival, and we need to think about ourselves and be strong subjects. But I think, to me, that's like, we're seeing the effects of this doctrine being so, that if the good people in the world, the people who would be prone to act in goodness toward other humans, if they're taught that they can't trust their actions, then that goodness is kind of diminished. It doesn't really get to take effect.
And every time they do something good, everyone suspects that it's not. And this is just me personally. Every time I ever did something good in church, I'm not even joking, there was always this underlying suspicion that I had negative reasons for doing it. You know what I mean? Like, even going into ministry and stuff, are you being prideful? And like, you can look at the interview between Francis Chan and Mark Driscoll on the Gospel Coalition. In the middle of this conversation about Francis Chan really, really dealing with some really intense stuff, and he's like leaving a church and starting a church, and he's got these things going on. Mark Driscoll's like, "Oh, are you just never content? Like, is it a sin problem in your heart?" And like, those questions are always in the back of every good action that we do. So you're right. Telling people they are not good, and when they are good, they do it for the wrong reasons, is a powerful tool to what became an explanation of sin is now a cause of sin and evil in the world, is what you're saying, right? Like, this theology itself perpetuates it.
That is what I'm saying. And I'm saying that insecurity paralyzes people from doing good by each other and makes them afraid. Yeah. And it makes us anticipate bad things. It makes us fundamentally anticipate bad things. So here's where it gets really interesting for me. There was a shift about 100 years ago in thinking about this, because a couple of people said, wait a minute, we've been focusing on the sin of the individual. And like, oh, is it inherently sinful to masturbate? Is it inherently sinful to do things by yourself on a desert island without anyone else present that you can do that would be evil against God, And theologians like Walter Rauschenbusch stood up and said, you know what? We've been asking the absolutely wrong question. Yeah. Sin and evil is not located in the individual. It's located in the structures of society and how we relate to each other. It's inherently in the relationship. And so theologians later, Martin Luther King, a lot of the feminist theologians came along and said, yeah, we really actually believe original sin is the human propensity to dominate other people and oppress them. And if we can get rid of that, we've addressed a whole host of trickle out effects, Yeah. So that's a completely different way to look at sin. Like, you don't have to completely throw out a doctrine of sin, but saying, it's not in our individual private times, but it's in how we act toward each other and what sorts of societies we build for our children.
And even in like a still individualistic, and even an evangelical Baptist theologian like Stanley Grenz, he would still locate sin in like the disruption of community. That's a general direction that a lot of people have headed toward, and I think that's awesome.
Well, it depends on what your community. If your community requires conformity and boundaries,
but just thinking of the ideal human community or whatever, or some at least healthy form of human community. But you're right, like. The idea that sitting on a desert island, like you said, you brought up masturbation or something like that, those things like being inherently sinful and wrong, that is like Gnosticism. That's not Christian. That's not historic Orthodox Christianity. That's the stuff that the early Christians would argue against, thinking that matter is evil and our bodies are evil and sinful. And that's like, there was a strong reaction in the New Testament against those ideas, but somehow we've, adopted them and they become a part of our thinking.
It also comes out of colonial theology, because in the age of colonialism, you have to create a system where like the civilized people are more inherently godly and like the quote unquote savages are not.
Yeah.
And so this evolved,
right? They have the Holy Spirit.
Right. Yeah. Which is weird because that's like the emphasis on enlightenment and rationality being closer to God. I mean, that's more of like a Greek ideal, but that was used for colonial expansion. And so what happens is, to this day, and I referenced the work of T.E. Hucks, to this day, some bodies, mostly bodies of color, mostly female bodies of color, are considered more ontologically or inherently physically evil. And so the history of slavery and the history of colonial oppression and expansionism is like fraught with, this is like really like gut-wrenching, but is fraught with examples of colonial overlords torturing the savage to save the man. Yeah. Like actually physically torturing people, physically maiming and torturing and beating and hurting people to try to get them to be civilized and closer to God, because whiteness is more godly and less inherently sinful. And so even in doctrines of total depravity, even when you hold that everyone is sinful, there's still a hierarchy present that calls some bodies more sinful. And so that's always really important to remember. Like, what is the politics of this doctrine doing? How's it actually playing out? Who's benefiting and who's losing? So sorry, that's the drum I beat, but I can't,
no, that's okay.
Like, I don't think we can ignore that. Like, to me, it's so incredibly huge. And so like, when you think about goodness as being civilized or controlled or orderly or impermeable, like all of that has to do with a historical conception of colonial narrative and not so much to do with the vision of the Bible necessarily, or even Orthodox theology. Like, we've inherited all of this crap and we have to unravel it and see what its effects are.
And like you said, taking away agency, right? That's what it comes down to. Colonialism is taking away the agency of some to increase the agency of others, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair definition of domination.
And that's the sad thing about original sin and total depravity, is that it robs us of our human agency, of any part of participation in the goodness. That's unfortunate.
Clearly, just like every other topic that we kind of get into, there's so much more to talk about. And I know that all of us have things that we'd like to add to the conversation, but we would like to leave that to our listeners. So before we kind of close out this conversation, what are your takeaways? What are the most important things to you as we think about this issue?
For me, as a Christian, I do believe that humanity needs Jesus. I do personally believe individuals need Jesus, that the human psyche and community needs Jesus, because in Jesus we have God forgiving and God taking the first step of grace toward people. And that's what we need to heal us personally, to heal us communally. We need that first step of forgiveness to be able to forgive our enemies and to create a better world. Like, that's an elemental part of my idea of the universe. But that does not mean that I have to accept original sin. And I think there are really good reasons not to. Or total depravity. I don't believe a baby that is born is inherently corrupted and sinful and evil and needs to be saved from that. I think that sin is something that we do. It is a reality that we have as a human society. Our biology is not sinful, but what we do with our biology can be, and we need God's grace. But to think of people as never able to do good, completely corrupt and unable to access truth unless they have God, in my own life has just led to really unfortunate consequences that have hurt individuals and I think infantilize entire communities. So it's time to step away from that. We're still embracing Jesus. We're still embracing the need for Jesus, but we're leaving behind the things that harm us as human beings.
I'm going to go a pretty different direction. I think everything you said is good. It's interesting, and it's more orthodox. It's way more orthodox than what I'm about to say. This might be upsetting to some people, but
warning: theological trigger ahead.
Theological trigger ahead. Okay, so if if we can do good on our own, if we are good on our own, that means that we have the ability. Let's just presume that that's true. Maybe through Christ, even if people don't believe in Jesus, like let's just say that people are fundamentally good as part of God's good creation. And so we have the propensity and the ability to heal ourselves and to act with goodness without question. And we have the ability to know what is good and evil based on how things play out in this world and how it affects people. And we know the own motivations of our hearts as being fundamentally good or bad. So I think that we need Jesus insofar as we needed someone to come and tell us that you guys are good, but you forgot. You forgot. And so remember what is good. Remember what right relationship and community looks like. Remember what compassion looks like. So I think of it not as like an external locus of control, an external power, as much as reminding us of what we've already got in us and what we already are. Like that's our true nature. So that's very different from what you said, Alan, but it's kind of like,
I still resonate with it. I still resonate with a lot of that. I probably wouldn't go all the way. I still think there's this external thing of, God needing to come to us, but you're right, is a very different vision from what I've heard. And I think that that's a very powerful one for a lot.
Yeah. And so my challenge is go back and read the Gospels try to put aside everything you've been taught about Jesus being a lamb to slaughter. Just try to put it aside. You don't have to reject it, but put it aside and really read the Gospels as Jesus coming to remind us that we're fundamentally good. Just try it and see what you come up with. And it really does resonate. Like you can read it faithfully that way. So that's what I'll put out as a challenge for reading.
So when Jesus tells people go and sin no more, Jesus assumes they can, right?
Jesus assumes they can. He assumes they can, and he's calling them back to what they should always have been, not telling them to change, telling them to reconcile to their true selves, which is kind of like a Buddhist-informed reading, but that's the most life-giving thing that I've been able to come up with.
There's a good book out there. I haven't read all of it, but it's called "Without Buddha, I Wouldn't Be a Christian," and some dude wrote it. So that's your thing.
Well, and I'm also so formed by feminist theology. This last thing I'll say is that if God really is a good creator and God is the epitome of love and life-givingness, then our theology should align with an ethic of life-givingness. And what does not breathe life into us and value all life in the way that we walk around in this world, then deserves critical reflection and deconstruction.
Well said. I agree 100%. Amen.
How about you, Jeff?
My takeaway is you're good enough, you're smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like you. And that if you don't feel that way, then perhaps the problem is not so much the damaging effects of the theology itself, but the frequency in which you expose yourself to it. So find new voices. Find new consistent voices that are telling you a new narrative, a new way to live, a new way to think about who you are and who the people around you are. Because I think that's the most important thing. Because these ideas can be easily dismissed, but they're harder and harder to dismiss when you're constantly exposed and they're a regular part of your narrative and your story with the community that you're involved in. So for this week, let us know what you think. If you have anything to add to the conversation, you can go to the show notes at irenicast.com/33, and there you can find the many links that I'm sure will be a part of the show notes here and go deeper on some of these topics. On the other side of the music, we are going to be celebrating, or pre-celebrating, I guess, because you'll probably be listening to this on Tuesday, October 20th, the day before Back to the Future Day. But we're going to be giving our predictions for the next 30 years of history. I would say probably for the past 3 or 4 years, I have regularly seen on my Facebook page a picture of the front of the DeLorean from Back to the Future saying that today is the day that Marty McFly went back to the future. And it was always wrong.
That's why when you suggested this segment, I was in the back of my mind like, is that really the day? Is this really the day that it's going to happen? Because we've been told for so long that it's Back to the Future Day. So are you sure, Jeff?
It is really the day. This is Wednesday, October 21st, 2015, is the actual day that Marty McFly in Back to the Future 2 went to the future, 30 years from his future, which was in 1985.
Man, that's such a great series.
It really is. This is kind of like, I'm a little giddy about this, because like those were some of my favorite movies as a kid. And I love how they didn't try to be, although some things ended up being true, they didn't try to be accurate to what they thought the future would actually be, but they tried to be accurate with what people hoped the future would be. And I really, it's still captured. Like this week, I don't have the time anymore to sit down and watch a whole block of movies, but every morning I'm watching each movie leading into Wednesday, and I'm very excited. So we thought it would be a good idea to kind of, since in 85 they gave their predictions of the future 30 years from that point, we are going to give our predictions for 30 years from this point today. So that would be what, October 21st, 2035? No, 2045? I don't know. I suck at math.
2045.
2045.
Okay, I'm so glad you suggested this also, because I am giddy, because I remember watching this movie as a kid, and when he has the hover skateboard, I like drooled over that. As a child, like I was like, that would be the coolest thing ever. And lo and behold, in the last year, I think it was Lexus has come out with an actual hover skateboard, and you can watch a video of it, and it is the coolest thing ever.
There was a prank by Tony Hawk that was really jacked up where they did that. But you're right. There is a real one that just came out for sure.
Wait, maybe I watched the prank one. How?
No, you didn't watch the Lexus one. Is the right one.
The real one just came out, but there was like 6 months there where everybody was all excited, and it was really sad.
Man.
The only caveat with the Lexus one is that it can only be used on magnetic surface.
Yeah, so it's not a real hoverboard. You know what's funny? There's a YouTube video.
Oh, shoot. I didn't know that.
There is a YouTube video out there of what would it be like if Marty McFly came to our 2015. And so there's like this little animation of like,
I saw that, yeah.
Hey, we don't have a hoverboard, but we have that like, I forgot what it's called, those little like step boards where you step on them and they move slightly faster than walking. Like when you lean forward.
Yeah, but imagine in 30 years it's going to be all over
flannel, the place. People are wearing flannel and baggy pants and like
and puffy vests. Yeah.
And then Biff comes to beat him up, and he's like, "I'm not going to beat you up. I'm just going to say things about you on the internet." And so because bullying's bad. Oh, it's so great.
That's so
good. A good one.
good.
Well, they did get surprisingly some things right, like the little things, like when Biff crashes through the clock tower, and there's like a drone taking a picture of him for the newspaper. So like that idea of like drones really being a part of that. There's even a drone walking someone's dog in one scene. Like, so they got the kind of the
so cool
use of drones in there. And then also the Cubs are in the World Series. How awesome is that?
Yay.
Or they probably will be in the World Series.
Okay, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, in 30 years, hover transportation will be a real thing, and you'll get to have your very own hover car, and that's very exciting.
And it'll drive itself. I think
Oh, heck yeah.
Okay, so here's my first prediction, and I'm going to do it because one of you probably has it. We're going to have self-driving cars for everybody 30 years from now. It'll be the majority because insurance companies will give you really low rates to have a self-driving car because they're going to be way more safe and take out human error. And eventually further in the future, people are going to look back at like us, like when I'm 70 years old, they're like, old man, you used to drive a car? And I would say, yes, I drove a car because I was awesome. And all of you stupid kids don't know how to drive cars anymore because you have your self-driving stuff.
Do all the young people in your future sound like Adam Sandler?
I don't know. Yeah, they're going to be weird. Well, see, there's so many human deaths and tragedy because of cars. And there's like, we're ruining our planet. We have all these problems.
I think car ownership is not going to be a thing anymore. You're not going to need to own that if it self-drives. You just call one up when you need it.
Unless the oil and the car companies, like in California, prevent every sort of legislation for public transportation. Anyway,
they can't block the tide. In 30 years,
it's going to be weird. It's going to.
What about teleportation?
They're going to look at the highways like the Old West. You know, the Old West is like just brought your gun and shot people because they were cheating at a card game. They're like, well, you were allowed to drive 70 miles an hour with people like 5 feet from you, and all you had was like metal surrounding you. You guys are crazy. Like, that's scary.
Alan, good people with guns stop card playing cheaters.
That's right.
Okay, do you think teleportation is in 30 years? Maybe it's in like a century, but I'm really excited about that also.
What do you mean? Like walking
teleportation,
like a sidewalk that goes faster than normal?
No, like to teleport, dude. Like,
do you know what?
Do you know?
Stop trolling me.
I thought we were talking about real things. I thought we were talking about reality.
What? Why is it not reality? Maybe we can figure out how to like
3D print your consciousness somewhere else. That's ridiculous.
I didn't even say that, but that's a really cool idea. I would love to 3D print my consciousness and then plant it into every other person's consciousness. See, like a virus.
Oh, God complex.
My brain is a virus. Yeah. And then everyone will play nice all the time.
Aw.
Oh.
Really? Do you think you'd get along with yourself that well?
I would. I want to marry myself, you guys.
So is that yours, Mona? Teleportation?
Well, no, that's my fake one. That's not a real one.
But that's the whole point of this exercise, right? A real one, like Alan's, no offense to Alan, but your prediction is pretty, like, predictable. Like, everyone knows that. Like, that's
Well, I have one that's not predictable.
Okay, what's the not predictable?
I'm going to wait for Jeff to give one of his before I say it.
Because you want to mock him if it's not up to standards?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, so Alan, you're going with cars. Mona, your fun one is going with teleportation. I'm going for droids. Like all my predictions are like fanciful. I don't care. Like Star Wars. Exactly. No, but I want a butler drone. Like I want someone to do stuff around the house. Like I want the whatever bicentennial man, whatever you want to call it, whatever. I want
that movie's so sad.
I want a robot slave in my house.
C-3PO.
C-3PO, whatever. Whoever's gonna do the things that I don't want to do around the house, because I think that that's what I want to do. Like whenever, if someone wants to run to the store for me, whatever, I want a robot, and I think that it's gonna happen.
What happens though when the artificial intelligence gets smarter than us? We've seen all the movies, right? You're just willing to risk it because you want that person so bad?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, for the time that by the time that they're really smart enough to really take over, I'll be dead. I'm fine, and I've saved all that time by having a robot in my house. That I have all this extra time to hang out with my kids and my friends and live my life. Because to me, time is the most valuable thing in the world, and if I can create that in any way possible, a robot seems like the perfect one to do that. So I want a robot butler. I want a robot Alfred. Because just as a caveat for my robot one, I don't want it to look like a human.
You don't want to feel sorry for it? Is that what
I don't want to empathize with it. I just want to treat it as it is, as a machine. I don't want.
Wait, what if
mine look like my little brother?
It'll probably look like C-3PO, because that just the nerd in me. It would be fun to have it look like something that's familiar to me.
Yeah. What if we put super intelligence in like dogs or monkeys, and you could have assistants that like would understand your voice commands?
No, I want it to be mechanical, nothing biological.
Something that you can smash if it makes you angry.
Exactly, and not feel bad at all about it.
Okay.
That's my deal.
Because it doesn't have DNA, it's less of a human than you.
Exactly.
So here's my second one. First was the car thing. This one I am super proud of because I thought of it like 5 years ago. I think in the future there will come a day when people will say click on that when they're pointing at something on a computer or a screen, and a person will, tap it or do it, but they won't know why or where the word click came from, because they've never used a mouse. They don't understand that there's a clicking noise. You're actually clicking the button. Everything's going to be touchscreen or voice command or eye command or whatever. And people will use the word click, but they won't know where it came from.
That is really incredibly specific.
That is the epitome of an Alan prediction right there.
It seriously is.
Tell me that's not going to happen, though. Come on.
Are you excited about it?
I'm excited. I think that I'm actually going to... What this came from was I read an article of people's predictions for the future, and they had like 100 predictions and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, I need to contribute something to futurism. I need to give my little piece to the world, and this is what it is. This is what's going to happen. You can count on it.
You're a post-clickist.
I am a post-clickist.
All right, so my second one is very feasible. Not likely to happen entirely, but very feasible. I am very excited about the possibility of green solar cities. And I think there might be a better term for this, but I'm not talking about like, we're encouraging bicycle riding. I'm talking about like faces of skyscrapers covered in edible plants and being completely solar sufficient, like having the technology to do hydroponics and solar power, like to grow so much that we've covered our whole cities in green. Like, wouldn't that be so beautiful? I would love to live in a city that everywhere you walk, it just feels like you're walking through the woods. I would love to live in that city.
I saw a meme that said elementary schools should teach gardening. That should be because food's kind of important. It was funny.
When I worked for a school, I was trying to campaign for this, and like the teachers and the administrator didn't like the idea. I'm like, why wouldn't you teach kids gardening? But I think it's because it was like an agricultural community, and the people who farmed and gardened were like immigrants, and they didn't want their kids.
You're like this post.
They didn't want their kids associated with immigrants. Yeah, isn't that freaking sad? Anyway.
Yeah, that's kind of sad. So my real one is medical scanning. To where in 30 years, in your home, you can use your phone or your watch or whatever and get a full-fledged medical scan, MRI,
what a
everything.
Great idea.
So it eliminates all the guesswork. Because now a doctor, I mean, how many stories have you heard of a doctor missing something or not saying you need an MRI because of the expense and everything that's a part of it, but just one button on your phone, a daily scan that gives you everything that we can possibly do now and more with just at home. And then it can be sent to your doctor and they can analyze it and you can figure out what the best course of treatment is.
But then the hospitals aren't going to make enough money off of the hypochondriacs that have to come in and...
Yeah, they're going to be able to fix more stuff because more people.
Then the hospitals will just get into the app making business and make a bunch of apps that they can buy and a freemium app where they can just buy a bunch of stuff to diagnose them.
And they're going to make you scared of everything. That's horrible.
No, you're like at the hospital, like on their hospital app, and they're like, an ad comes up, and they're like, "Play our game," and it's like Operation, but like on your phone, like, but you're operating on your cell phone.
Oh, okay. I would only go along with that. Like, I think that would just lead to like people becoming even more hypochondriacs and finding things that have to be fixed and blah blah blah. That'd be horrible.
It's like Gattaca.
But if you had a 3D printer at home that would not just scan you, but then fix the issue for you, automated in your house, then I'd be down for that.
Like you need a kidney and it's like, oh, no problem.
I gotta print one. Yeah.
We can live forever.
Oh, you have an ulcer in your stomach? Let me print a little piece of stomach tissue and put it on there for you. I would totally be down for that.
Putting it in there for you, though, I mean, that's...
Well, you trust some dude who, like,
studied for 8 years?
He used to get his ABCs wrong, and he's going to stick his hand inside of your abdomen and fix it? No.
Oh, you know what? The 3D printer could also deploy an army of micro robots that go in there and do the operation for you.
That's what I'm talking nanobots.
Yeah. No, the nanobots are the 3D printer, and they print it in place right where it's at.
They write it. Yeah. Molecule by molecule.
Yes, and you don't need to load them with the right material because we use Mona's teleportation technology that teleports the material into the nanobot and then prints that right there. I should be a science fiction writer.
Cry. I'm so excited right now.
That's not going to happen.
What? It could.
Oh, yeah, but let's just get excited about the word click and no one knowing what it's about. But
we know that's going to happen.
But that's not awesome. Exciting.
That's so cool. We know the future. We are magicians.
Yeah, you cannot talk about
magicians.
Okay.
Oh, come on. That's exciting.
Well, I think that'll do it for us this week. If you like what you hear, you can go support the show by going to iTunes and Stitcher to rate, review, and subscribe. And you can contact us anytime at our feedback page at irenicast.com/feedback. So for this week, everyone should go and watch Back to the Future 2 at least, since that's the actual movie. But I would recommend the entire trilogy, although I have serious plot hole issues with the third one. But anyway.
Yeah.
So that'll do it for us this week. So for this week, I'm Jeff.
I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
Thanks for joining the conversation.
Enjoy clicking while you can.